The room was smaller than you'd think. Gray walls. A single overhead light, no windows, just a steel table, two federal agents in dark suits, and a long, narrow safety deposit box sitting between them like a loaded gun no one wanted to touch. Outside, the hallway was quiet. But beyond those walls, beyond the reinforced doors of the Los Angeles Federal Reserve Vault, the world was loud. Newspapers screaming. Senators demanding answers. The name Sinatra splashed across every front page in the country. Not for a hit song or a sold-out show, but for something darker. Something the Bureau had been circling for years. Frank Sinatra was untouchable. That's what people said. Untouchable because of his voice, his fame, his connections. Untouchable because he moved through rooms full of presidents and mobsters with the same easy charm, the same tilt of the fedora, the same knowing smile. But untouchable also meant something else. It meant protected. And in 1966, Edgar Hoover wanted to know by whom. The box had been sealed for 12 years. Sinatra hadn't touched it since 1954. Hadn't needed to. He'd been riding high. Movies, records, Vegas, everything a man could want. But the FBI had a warrant now. A federal investigation into organized crime, into money laundering, into ties between entertainers and the families who ran the nightclubs where they sang. And Sinatra's name kept appearing in the margins of reports filed by agents who'd been watching him since the 1940s. So they opened the box. One of the agents, a young man named Coleman, slid the key into the lock. He glanced at his partner, a senior investigator named Marsh, who'd been with the Bureau since before the war. Marsh nodded. No ceremony. No hesitation. The lock turned. The lid lifted. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. No guns. No blackmail photos or ledgers with names that would crack open the underworld. Just papers. Documents. Letters. Personal things. The kind you'd expect a man to keep locked away. Birth certificates. Contracts. A few photographs, edges worn from handling, but underneath it all, folded carefully, almost reverently, was a single envelope. Thick, unmarked, sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. Coleman reached for it. Marsh stopped him. "Photograph it first," Marsh said. "Everything, exactly as it is." They did. Every angle, every item cataloged. Then Marsh picked up the envelope himself. He held it to the light. No writing on the outside, no address, no name. Just the wax seal, pressed with an insignia neither man recognized. He broke it open. Inside were three things. A handwritten letter dated 1943. The handwriting was careful, precise, like someone had taken their time. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. A photograph, black and white. A young woman, maybe 25, standing on a pier. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking out at the water. Her hair caught in the wind. Her expression unreadable. And a receipt. A payment receipt from a private hospital in New Jersey. December 1943. The amount was significant. The name on the receipt wasn't Sinatra's. Coleman read the letter first. Then he handed it to Marsh without a word. Marsh read it twice. Then he folded it back up, slid it into the envelope, and placed everything into a leather briefcase he'd brought with him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Coleman had been with the Bureau long enough to know what silence meant. They locked the box. They left the vault. They drove back to the field office in complete quiet. By the time they reached Hoover's desk in Washington 2 days later, the story had already started to change. Frank Sinatra had enemies. That wasn't new. Some of them wore badges. Some wore expensive suits and worked for families whose names you didn't say out loud, unless you were ready to disappear. Some were just people who hated the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to bend the world to his will without ever asking permission. But Hoover's hatred was different. It was personal. It was patient. It was built on years of watching Sinatra walk into rooms Hoover couldn't control, shake hands with people Hoover couldn't touch, and walk out untouched himself. Hoover had files on everyone: presidents, senators, movie stars, civil rights leaders, files thick enough to bury careers, end marriages, destroy lives. But Sinatra's file was different. It was incomplete. There were gaps, rumors that couldn't be confirmed, associations that made no sense. And now this. Hoover sat alone in his office when Marsh delivered the briefcase. The blinds were drawn. The door was locked. Marsh placed the case on the desk, stepped back, and waited. Hoover didn't open it right away. He stared at it. Then he looked at Marsh. "Is it what we thought?" Hoover asked. "No, sir," Marsh said. "It's worse." Hoover's expression didn't change. He opened the case. He removed the envelope. He read the letter slowly, his jaw tight, his hands steady. Then he looked at the photograph. Then the receipt. When he finished, he placed everything back in the envelope, closed the case, and locked it in his desk drawer. "No one sees this," Hoover said. "No one talks about this. Not Coleman. Not you. Not anyone. Sir, the investigation is over," Hoover said. "As far as Sinatra is concerned, it's over." Marsh didn't move. He'd worked for Hoover long enough to know when to push and when to stay silent. This was a moment for silence. "Understood, sir," Marsh said. He left the office. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in 30 years, J. Edgar Hoover sat at his desk and felt something he almost never felt. Fear. Not of Sinatra. Not of the mob. Not of scandal or exposure or political consequence. Fear of what the letter meant. Of what the photograph meant. Of what a man like Sinatra would do if the truth ever came out. And more than that, fear of what Hoover himself had become. Chasing ghosts and building files on people whose only crime was living louder than he ever could. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Russo. She'd been a singer. Not famous. Not successful. Just a girl from Hoboken who'd met a young Frank Sinatra in 1942, before the world knew his name, before the screaming crowds and the movie deals and the headlines. She'd loved him. He'd loved her. Or at least, that's what the letter said. But in 1943, she got pregnant. Sinatra was married. He was starting to break through. His career was fragile. One scandal could end it before it even began. So they made a choice. She would leave. She would go to New Jersey, to a private hospital where women went when they needed to disappear for a while. She would have the baby. And Sinatra would pay for everything. The hospital, the delivery, the care, the adoption. She never saw him again. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was just sad. A goodbye written by someone who understood that the world didn't make room for love when ambition was on the line. She wrote that she didn't blame him. She wrote that she hoped he'd find happiness. She wrote that she'd never tell anyone. And she hadn't. The baby, a girl, had been adopted by a family in Pennsylvania. The records were sealed. The hospital had closed in 1951. There was no trail. No way to trace it. No way to prove it. Just a letter, a photograph, and a receipt locked in a box that Sinatra had never opened again. Hoover stared at that letter for a long time. He thought about what it would mean to release it. The headlines. The scandal. The end of Sinatra's untouchable status. The satisfaction of watching him fall. But he also thought about what it would mean to the woman, to the child. Now a grown woman herself. living a life that had nothing to do with Frank Sinatra or the FBI, or the weight of secrets men carried in locked boxes. And he thought about himself, about the files he kept, the lives he'd ruined, the power he'd wielded not to protect the country, but to control it, to punish people for being free in ways he never could be. He thought about all of that, and then he locked the drawer. 3 weeks later, a quiet memo went out to the field offices investigating Sinatra. The language was bureaucratic, clinical. It said the investigation had been closed due to insufficient evidence. It said no further action was warranted. It said the matter was resolved. No one questioned it. No one asked why. Hoover's word was final. But inside the bureau, people noticed. Agents who'd been building cases for years suddenly reassigned. Files that had been active suddenly archived. And Sinatra, who'd been waiting for the hammer to fall, who'd been bracing for the fight of his life, just kept singing. He never knew what was in the box. He never asked. He never went back to that vault. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he'd buried it so deep that even thinking about it felt dangerous. Or maybe he knew that some things, once locked away, should stay that way. The woman in the photograph, Catherine Russo, died in 1978. Quiet. Alone. She never married. She never had other children. She worked as a seamstress in a small town in upstate New York, and when she passed, only a handful of people attended her funeral. The daughter, if she ever existed, never came forward. Maybe she never knew. Maybe she did, and chose silence. Maybe she built a life so far removed from the chaos of fame and power and secrets that the truth didn't matter anymore. Hoover died in 1972. When they cleaned out his office, they found files on everyone. Presidents, activists, actors, athletes. Thousands of pages documenting affairs, mistakes, fears, weaknesses. But they never found the envelope. They never found the letter. It had been destroyed years before, burned in a fireplace in Hoover's private residence on a cold night in 1967. The ashes scattered, the evidence erased. Sinatra lived until 1998. He sang until his voice gave out. He fought. He loved. He made enemies and kept friends and walked through the world like a man who'd seen too much to ever be surprised again. But sometimes, late at night, in the quiet hours when the crowds were gone and the lights were off, and it was just him and the weight of everything he'd done and everything he'd chosen not to do, he'd sit alone in the dark and think about a girl from Hoboken who'd loved him before the world did. He never spoke about her. He never wrote about her. He never opened that box again. And when he died, the only people who knew the truth were gone. The safety deposit box was eventually cleared out by Sinatra's estate. The papers were cataloged, archived, donated to libraries and museums. The photographs were framed, displayed, sold at auction. The contracts and letters became part of history, studied by scholars, referenced in books, immortalized in documentaries. But the envelope was never found, because it had never been there. Not in any official inventory, not in any estate record. It had existed in a space between what was known and what was buried, between what the world demanded and what one man decided to protect. J. Edgar Hoover spent his life collecting secrets. He built an empire on fear, on control, on the belief that knowledge was power. And power was everything. But in that moment, sitting alone in his office with a letter in his hands and a choice in front of him, he learned something he'd spent decades refusing to believe. Some secrets aren't weapons. Some secrets are just pain. And sometimes, the strongest thing a man can do is let them go. The world never knew. The headlines never came. The scandal never broke. Frank Sinatra kept singing. Catherine Russo kept sewing. The daughter, wherever she was, kept living. And in a locked drawer in a dead man's office, a truth too heavy to carry simply stopped existing. Not because it wasn't real, but because someone, for once, chose mercy over power. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of all the things that didn't need to be said, all the lives that didn't need to be destroyed, all the pain that didn't need to be weaponized. And in that silence, something rare happened. Not justice, not victory, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you realize that some battles aren't worth fighting, that some truths don't need to be told, that some people, no matter what they've done or who they've been, deserve to be left alone. Sinatra never knew. Hoover never told. And the world moved on.